Well, we're going into the second part of the first day, and for me, I thought it was really inspiring to hear the speakers so far, so excited for what to come. And I will hand over to Jeffrey right away, so take it from here.
Am I not? Okay. I was told a story once about, she was relating to me as though it was her story. I'm sure it wasn't. But she told me about making roast beef with her mother. And she'd go over every Sunday, and her mother taught her how to prepare the beef and how to prepare the pot. And she would cut a 1/4 inch off each end and wrap it in something and then put it in the oven for a certain amount of time. And so Madge, went on and followed these instructions and did like her mother did. And one day, years later, she said to her mother, what's the purpose of cutting a 1/4 inch off each end? Is it so you can sear it better? Do you get a better result? Are there juices or something? And her mother said, well, no, that's how it fits into my pan, because it's small. When I learned about tailoring and sewing, there were a lot of things that I was taught to do, and I did them because that's what you do, without really necessarily understanding what I was doing or why I was doing. So I'm going to back things up a little bit, and before we talk about ironwork and shaping, I want to look at why we're doing some of these things. And in order to do that, I'm going to start with a very basic principle, but I'm going to do it on the women's mannequin because I'm going to do something and I want to make it big so it's visible at the back. So if you will bear with me for a couple minutes. So typically in tailored clothing, we want to try to keep the plaid lines level to the floor. And in menswear, we manage to do that through the seat and most part through the chest. But I want to look at some of what's going on when we attempt to do that. So I'm going to start by draping this form. What's rubbing? There's noise.
It's my phone.
Oh.
Can this go off?
There's sometimes people who ask me if I was going to do one course at school, what's the one thing you would do? Draping. Because really, it's fitting. It's the art of fitting. You're just putting the cloth. We get so hung up sometimes on measurements and numbers and systems and drafts and all this stuff. And really, if you just let the fabric tell you what it wants to do, it will. So, shoulder dart. We don't have one of those in menswear, but it's there somewhere. And if you're not familiar with the principle of the dart transfer, if I have a dart above here, I can transfer it anywhere around the apex. I could take this dart value, and I could put it here, or I could put it over there, or if I didn't want a shoulder dart, I could drop it beneath and put the entire value, so I shouldn't talk with pins in my mouth, below the waist. That's too tight. But observe what's happened to the crosswise grain. It's dropped. So that we can take all that value, if we want to keep this straight, we want to be cognizant of that shoulder dart. One other thing I want to look at here before we wrap up with her. Which is kind of tricky because I went and chopped it up. Well, we'll do it on him instead. Because believe it or not, that shoulder dart is there. You just hand me pins. Okay, now hand me the scissors. Oh, one more pin. Pin. Actually, no. Yeah. Scissor. So if I want to keep the crosswise grain, it's there. It's small, but it's there. So let's mark it in. So there's two things I can do to eliminate that if I want to keep my crosswise grain square and not have this dart. So the first thing I could do, stick a shoulder pad. I don't particularly care for a whole bunch of padding, but it can sometimes help things out a lot. Sometimes we can completely eliminate the need for the shoulder dart. But in this case, we still have, and that's why I wanted to do it on her. I shouldn't have cut up the fabric. It's still there. It's very small, but there's still a value. If I wanted to get rid of it, of course now I locked it. The crosswise grain starts to drop. So I've still got a dart. Let's look at the back. Scissors. So even with the pad, I still have easily 2.5 centimeters, almost 3 centimeters I have to get rid of. So we've got some here, we've got some at the back. So how are we going to do that? Thank you. I'm done with this now. No. Can we go to the laptop, please? So when we talk about tailoring, why is this so tight after lunch? Though we sometimes use cotton and linen and silk, typically we use wool. And why specifically wool? If we look at the structure of wool, it's quite unique and it's quite complex. There's an outer structure of scaly things called cuticles, and there's an inner structure to it. That cuticle structure allows it to be shaped, meaning we can stretch it, we can shrink it, we can bend it, we can do a whole lot of things to it. And then the inner structure is hygroscopic. What does hygroscopic mean? It means it absorbs moisture from the atmosphere. It also means that it can absorb 30% of its weight without feeling wet. So that's a consideration when you're doing testing and things. We'll talk about physical properties of cloth and test parameters. And we have a lab at Hickey Freeman where we test our cloth for its suitability for tailoring. And one of the things that we need to look at is how much a particular fabric will grow and contract just from humidity. Because we make full canvas garments, there's a layer of canvas inside and a layer of wool on the outside. And if we go and we press the fronts and we put all the humidity in it and draw it all out and it kind of shrinks, and then we baste right away to the canvas that's been sitting over here without letting them rest, it can absorb humidity back from the environment. And what happens when it absorbs the humidity, it expands. So if you've ever seen a canvas coat front that was just wrinkled all the way down the front, chances are either they didn't condition the air correctly, or they basted it too quickly, or there's something going on with the humidity. But more about that later. So here's another fiber that very much resembles wool. And the reason I talk about this one is that I think it helps us remember the idea of shaping wool a little better. It's human hair. This shape is not naturally occurring. She did not roll out of bed looking like this. She used certain tools that used heat and sometimes moisture to give it shape. It can hold that shape really well, sometimes too well. I've got a cowlick that I can't do anything with. The thing is, if you expose it to the wrong conditions or the wrong kind of humidity, yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about ironwork. And when we talk about ironwork, it's when a tailor takes some cloth, preferably wool, and takes an iron and gives it shape. Because one of the things we're doing is those little darts and things that we don't want, we're getting rid of them. Or we're creating shape because there's a seam that we need in a place that we don't want a seam. Or we do little tricks to fudge stuff and create shape. So we got to be familiar with tailor shorthand, because you might see this in a book or instructions, or more commonly if you work in like the environment that Frederick was describing. You've got a cutter who has to send things off to a tailor. The cutter will do the fitting, and he'll mark up a garment of areas that need to be stretched or areas that need to be shrunk. And so these are common symbols that we see both in books and in tailor shops, indicating what we need to do. For example, this page from an old Müllenzon, and then this was Seitner's The Art of Fitting Gentlemen's Garments, where he marked up the jacket as we might see it. So we can study these, and though a lot of us are trained that the garment must always be stretched here, must always be shrunk here, we need to get out of that thinking and think we need to do it to the extent that we need to fit this particular shape. Sometimes we need more, sometimes we need less, sometimes we don't need anything at all. Or sometimes we have to, oh my God, put a dart in the arm side in the back because, well, the shoulder blade's just so developed. So this is what a coat might look like. We've got some shrinking on the top sleeve. We've got a whole lot of shrinking and stretching on the back. Little stretching on the waist and the side body. We've got some stretching on the front, little stretching here, and this is a real controversial one. And then some shrinking in the roll line and maybe on the chest. So what's really happening is here, so we've still indicated the stretching, but basically we've got a whole bunch of darts, and we saw that we can transfer dart all the way around the apex. So I had almost 3 centimeters in the shoulder I needed to get rid of. I can shrink a certain amount into the shoulder seam, but I certainly can't shrink 3 centimeters. But maybe I can put a centimeter into the shoulder and then put another centimeter onto the arm side and maybe transfer into the back, depending on the shoulder blade. I hope this works. So if you're not familiar with the suit factory, oh, come on. This is cute. Sometimes I hate Adobe. Well, sorry, MacP, I had a video of one of your presses where we've taken the shape, and maybe we're so used to seeing them in the tailored industry where it's got the shape of the front, the shape of the shoulder, and we put some rippling in here and some rippling in here, and then we press it flat. We don't appreciate what we're doing, where we're shrinking the roll line, we're shrinking here. We're doing a lot of this iron work in an automatic fashion. And what are we doing? We're just transferring darts from the shoulder to the roll line, to the armhole, to other places. Now, and I can't even advance my slide. There we go. Then there's the type of shaping where it's not necessarily about the fit, but we want to, in this case, I don't want to have a seam right down the front. I want to push it off to the back. Well, there's a particular shape. So if you look at the top left, there's that curve in the shape of the sleeve, and that dotted line is where I want to fold it over. So just beneath it is the shape it would take if I just folded it. But that's not the shape I want. I want it to curve forward. So what I do in the top right is I would stretch that, which then allows me to get the one at the bottom right to look the way it should. And I'm assuming this video won't work. Maybe I can find them here. Because this one's kind of cool. Bear with me, I'm sorry. And we did test this. The thing is, like, you text it once and it works, and then you do it again and it doesn't. Have we seen that? Yay. Okay. So you see that there's some rippling along the inseam of the sleeve. So how did that happen? See, the shape, the most of the sleeve is kept flat, and the front of it, they've put this undulating shape into it. So when she puts the sleeve on, only that front area is going to get steam, and you'll notice that there's 2 different pressure devices that are going to close on it. So it's holding tight around the sleeve where we don't want it to stretch and move. And it's going to come down with those teeth, and it's going to stretch out the front. Now, there's other ways of doing this in factories. Well, you know what? I wouldn't put the whole sleeve in there because you don't need to stretch the undersleeve. They have. I'm not telling them they're wrong. Well, so the rest of the sleeve is not getting any steam. See, as it comes up, there's 2 zones to this, if I press play. So that's just the portion of just here. It's just stretched out and there's steam, and then there's the rest of it that's holding. There's no steam, so it's only affecting this portion of it. Now I can't find my slides. You know, maybe we'll forget about slides for now. So in a tailor shop, we would typically do this work as soon as it's cut. You're on mute. Oh, it's back. So hopefully we can see, as I was saying, this is my sleeve. When I fold it back to hide that seam, can we see that that curve is going in the opposite direction? That's not what I want. So I'm going to pull it and stretch it in that opposite direction. And then depending on the amount of curve and the shape of the sleeve, you may be more or less. If your sleeve is very straight, you don't need a whole lot of it. If it's very curved, you're going to need a lot of it. Thing is, some fabrics take to the iron better than others. See, I've got my extra length, so now when I fold that back, I've got my nice shape. So in their factory, they put it on the machine and stretch it. And usually when I see that machine in action, they've just got the top sleeve on there first, not the undersleeve too. So they'll stretch it and then they'll join it. And in so doing, both of them theoretically are the same length. Another way of doing it, however, is I've got a top sleeve that's a certain length, and I, as a pattern maker, have to have figured out how much longer the undersleeve needs to be so that when I stretch the top sleeve, it ends up the right length. Then I would join them, adding a certain amount of fullness. Oops, first time using this machine. And I'm going to let the feed dogs underneath pull the fullness in to evenly distribute it. And then I go back to flat. So I end up with an undersleeve with a bunch of fullness in it. And I've sometimes gone into factories and they say, we put the fullness and then we need to shrink it in, we need to shrink it in. No. There's other machines that are shaped. You've got two sort of half-moon shapes where if you put the sleeve on correctly, oh wow, tension knobs off. So I've done that operation, which I have to do anyway. I've set the fullness in, and then just placing the sleeve in the right shape when I bust the seam, I'm doing basically both operations in one step. So I'm hoping you can see kind of where my seam is displaced, and instead of, as pattern makers, we should understand that normally our seam should run along here if that's the shape we want. I'm able to displace it by stretching this. Oops. So let's look at the front. As I said, it's typical to put a certain amount here. And in factories, we're used to the idea that we pull the bridle a certain amount. It's usually a fixed amount, which when you think about it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, well, a big shape is going to take more than that. But in a tailor shop, we may shrink this a little bit here. We may shrink this a little bit here if we've decided that what we need to create to get rid of that dart is such that I need to shrink it. And then another very important element, as I said, sometimes we stretch here. It was more typical in earlier days to stretch along the armhole along here, because what we're trying to create is a pocket here. So I could create it by stretching a little bit. Maybe I'm not getting as much as I want. A lot of tailors would do this. But that would create even more of a boat shape. So we call that in Italian the spalla inselata, so like a saddle or a pagoda. It's not everybody's taste. But generally what we're trying to get is this extra length here, this pocket here. Because that's what it's doing is it's creating room for the shoulder point and making the weight of the coat sit right here. It's important for comfort because when you're moving, if it's riding on your shoulder points, it's uncomfortable. But also, if the weight of the coat is sitting on your shoulder, as you move, the whole thing's lifting off you and going all over the place. So however it is that you get to this place, this is important. More often in a canvas factory, we won't do that stretching. And in the basting of the canvas, we will put a little pinch here, which will then get basted in there and pressed out. And that's basically creating the same effect of having that length there. But again, there's multiple ways of getting to the same place. And then we might shrink this ahead. And again, in a tailor shop, we do it first. In a factory, we try to incorporate it into the movements we do. So first, the thread was not in the tension disc correctly. I never thought I'd have to be a sewing machine mechanic to be a tailor. But you kind of have to. So. Here we are. So for a long time, I put the fullness here and I pulled the tapes here because, well, like that 1/4 of an inch on the roast beef, that's just what you do, without fully understanding why I was doing it. And this is a step that doing it here, it's kind of tricky because if you don't do it right, you can really mess it up and you can make a mess. But it is something like if you want a nice shape, a nice Bombay, or if you have a big dart value that you need to transfer out and you can't take it all out of the roll line just by drawing the bridle, some of it may need to go into the armhole. So rather than shrinking it first in the shop, then I would put it on fairly flat. And then here I'm going to draw it a little more too. So what we would have seen in that early MACP video was that we had some fullness here, and that tension disc is still not right. And then later I would put a bridle tape along here to shrink this line, which may not actually be enough. We'll get there in a sec. We saw that dart on the back. And again, there were a couple ways of getting there. I could stretch the pocket, or I could shrink, or if I needed, I could do a combination of both. Let's say the dart I got, it was this huge thing. I could maybe say, okay, if I need to take out 4 centimeters here, I can account for 1 centimeter here, 1 centimeter here, then I need the equivalent of another 2 centimeters of stretch through the blade. So if we're making patterns for a factory, and we're engineering these things, it's a lot of those things that you got to think about. And then also, if I'm shrinking this a certain amount, then what does that do for my sleeve fullness? So there's a lot of stuff when we're making factory patterns that have got to be thought about in advance. So what would I do? I've got this flat back, and this is where we talk about tailors as being 3D artists, because I can take something completely flat, and I would stretch the waist a little bit. Then I would stretch the waist a little bit. And there's a couple of ways of getting this, but I like to fold it right around where the blade is going to be. And typically, if this was in a tailor shop, I would have my cross marks here from where the blade actually was, so I know I'm stretching it in the right place. And I would fold it along that area. And this movement is at the same time stretching out the blade and then shrinking. And I'll try to do it from the other side so you see what's going on there. I'll have no vacuum. So I'm stretching this, and these ripples here, I'm going to shrink out. Then I give myself a nice crease, which I take out. So I've given myself some nice length for the waist, then I've got this massive pocket for the shoulder blade here. I'm going to really try to go back to my slides for the next portion, because this is... Oh, we're back. No? Can we... Ah, there we go. So the collar's another place. If we understand about pattern making, typically to achieve the shape on the bottom, we would need a seam. We'd need a two-piece collar. So we would have a piece with a half-moon shape on the top and a half-moon shape on the bottom, but we start with something that's actually got a really straight line. So what are we doing? Not doing much if I can't find my collars. So I'm either just going to straight out give it this shape just by pressing, or if I want more consistency. There. Come on. Got this nasty finger guard, which makes it hard to thread. There. So I'd put my tape on flat until I missed a stitch, get to roughly the shoulder point. Then I'm going to start drawing it. So I'm shrinking the roll line. And how much you have to do this depends on the shape of the shoulders. And then I go back to being pretty flat. So I've created these ripples. I've drawn in the roll line, which is going to give me the same effect, except without the tape, with this, when this goes to the dry cleaner and they put it on one of those inflatable steam dummies, and you get like that crazy hair effect, at least with this, with the tape, it's holding it in place. It's not going to move. I would normally need some extra stretch along the edge line, and so I'm going to build in some fullness onto my top collar. So it's this constant sort of play and knowing of what am I stretching, what am I shrinking, how I'm going to build it into my pattern. So they just sew it together, and then when they press it, they don't even know what they're doing, but they're creating the shape. They're doing this traditional ironwork technique without even knowing they're doing it. Let's look at pants. So pants are really complicated, even though they seem like it's just two cylinders. But to get a nice fit, especially, I mean, we're lucky in the US because we wear big baggy pants, but in Europe where they're really slim, it's tough to get them to fit and hang right because it actually requires a whole lot of shaping. See, we're stretching the front of the thigh, shrinking in the middle, stretching the back, shrinking the back of the thigh, and then shrinking the calf and stretching. We're doing a whole lot of work to this pant in order to make it hang right. So if I put the two panels together, just creased evenly, and put them together, we see that we've got this big empty space down the seam that somehow we have to fill in. Or when I bend the back of the pant to fit to the front, we're going to get some extra length. So here's some photos from, I think, 13 years ago, when I was making a pant and trying to show somebody the principle, where when I bend the back of that pant, you see that extra length at the back, that ripple. I don't want that. I don't want that extra junk hanging there. So that's where these ironwork techniques come in. I'm going to do the stretching, do the shrinking, and then after, and I chose the stripe, and I have a stripe, so that you can see what would normally be a straight line in the back is actually curved, and I've straightened out the seam. Then when I join it, I'm also going to do some more of the shrinking and stretching in the front to really give that shape around the calf. It's not soft. It looks like a bell bottom. It wasn't. So this is where I took the pants and I sewed the seams and pressed the crease flat and put them on. That's me. Just to show what it would look like with no ironwork in it, this pattern. Then I took them apart and I did my usual shrinking and stretching, and that's the result. So it does make a difference. Where's my pants? I lost my pants. So we'll have a quick look at so I might start by creasing it down the middle, like and if I left it there, I'd get the result like we had in that first picture where they were all puddling everywhere. But instead, I'm going to stretch along the thigh, the front of it, and shrink that amount in. And then I'm going to do the reverse on the bottom. Stretch this a little bit and shrink that. Then on the back, this is the calf area. So when I create some length for the calf, so I'm going to stretch out that portion of it and shrink in the front. And just like that sleeve that I showed you where we can do it all before or we can incorporate it in the pattern, and often what I can do is just draft the pattern. We've got the notches at the knee, and I'll just shift it by a centimeter, which is going to displace some of the fullness down in the calf where we need it, and shift the rest of it up to the thigh. It's quite simple. Stretch this bit of the thigh a little bit first. Give some extra length for the seat. And then get rid of that pooling in the back. So if I had a wider table, that it did both pieces on the right side. I would end up with a shape that looks like that, which is going to conform to the curve of the leg and then the curve of the calf. So that's for the ironwork. Now let's talk about canvas. So I mentioned that there's a lot of things that we do in tailoring to hide defects and to fill in things, and so canvas is very important, but it's also very misunderstood. these videos. It's a shame, it was cool. Maybe I can. Nope. Oh well. Oh, it came back. Well, you get the idea. It was a cool little thing you can do in 3D. So why do I want to do my canvas and stuff in 3D? Because you can do stuff that the ecom people really like. They like to stick this on a website. But since we're not ecom people, we're technical designers, let's look at my slides. Wrong slideshow. I apologize again. It's open. Ah, canvas. So there's several different types of canvas, and if you're not familiar with them, we'll start with the piece that goes all the way down the front. We might refer to as canvas, wool canvas, hymo. And basically, it's a piece of cloth that, if you can see that there's some gray stuff running across the length. And that's goat hair. And it's woven in because goat hair is a little bit more springy and more firm than just wool. But we've built this mostly wool, there's some cotton, sometimes some viscose, and we've put the goat hair in so that it's a little springier on the cross. And when we give it some shape with a press, it's going to keep it, if we do it right. And one of the things that's really important when considering canvas is that you want a wool warp, going this way. Because we talked about wool being hygroscopic. So if I were to take this and take some piece of cloth and baste them together evenly, and then I do it at the wrong atmospheric conditions, and then I ship it to Florida and it's humid, the wool can expand. And that's where we get these puckerings. So typically in a canvas factory, we've got these misters from the ceiling that mist water to try to keep the humidity between 45 and 65% relative humidity. And when you're going to test these things, you want to condition them first too. So typically we would put our fabric and our canvas in a special room at 65% relative humidity and 20 degrees centigrade, something like that, metric. Oh. Let them sit for 24 hours together. And that's why sometimes you'll also see humidity chambers in canvas factories, because you've got to keep these at the same conditions atmospherically if you're basting them together. Or if you've got them together and then you're going to cut them or do all sorts of stuff. They have to gel together. It's not like when you've got a fusible down the front, though that can be an issue too sometimes if you get into issues of like differential shrinkage. But that's not bespoke tailoring. We won't talk about fusing. So I'll pass these around if you're not familiar with canvas. This is Article 1360 from Chargeur. Oh, we lost my slide. There, thank you. The next important piece of canvas is haircloth. So the French word for horsehair is crin de cheval, which gave us the word crinoline. Why? Because hoop skirts were originally made from puffed horsehair. Those big things were horsehair. And so it's not new that we put horsehair in clothing. In fact, it has a long history. And there's a reason. It's very lightweight, but in one direction it's very springy. We get a lot of bounce, a lot of recovery. But they can only make it this wide. Why? They only make the tails that long. So Chargeur product 721, I don't know if it's Z or N, it was mislabeled. You see that in the simulation, I've got on the cross grain a whole lot of stability. In the length, it's pretty soft. And so depending on the effect I want to get, I might turn this a little bit. I might put it in the whole chest, and then I might paint a piece of shoulder that typically these little things that happen here, these call them cigars, I don't know why. I might put the hairline of the piece going this way to spread it out. So we're thinking about the physics of these pieces of canvas, which I will pass around. And some white stuff, because they make white horses. I'm out of time. Oh boy, okay. Okay. So, quickly. I was going to go into how we can shape these, because we actually can. We can create layers. Oh, last thing. So, if we wanted something wider than the hair cloth that's really narrow, there's also a product from Chargeur, I mean, everybody makes it. From them specifically, it's 7315, which is a wrapped hair. So with normal horsehair, we've got a pick of hair every pick. So every warp yarn is horsehair. In wrapped hair, what they've done, and they could actually make it wide, in this case, it's every third pick is a whole bunch of hair strands that are wrapped in cotton to make a warp yarn. So it's a bit less expensive. It's also a little softer. So if you don't want a really meaty chest piece, you can go into that. Then we would cover with some felt, typically. This one is SFT 80. And because I need to wrap up. Okay. When I'm building the canvas, we talked earlier about some of the things that we do in the cloth, and we may do something differently. And here, maybe easier if I go to, so there's the front. I would draft my canvas, and you notice at the shoulder there's that white line. I'm going to create a slit here where we insert, we call it a wedge or a puff, where I actually pull that open and put another piece of canvas in it, creating that length. So even though I had to do a whole bunch of shaping and stuff on the wool because I don't want that thing showing, I can do it in the canvas. And so I've created that length here. There's that canvas. The next piece I would put in would be a chest piece where you've noticed the dart, the waist dart, I've rotated it so not to have all the thickness layered on top of it on the waist. So because we saw that dart transfer, we put it anywhere around the apex. I can close it here and open it there. Then depending on what I did at the chest, I may put a cut across the chest and close that to give some Bombay. I've also got a slit at the shoulder, which I'll open, but there too, I've pushed it off to the side so as not to have thickness. Then I'd put my 721N, my hair cloth, because the preceding piece could all be hair cloth, or if I wanted something softer, I could put wrapped hair. And then I want a piece of bridle over top, some more canvas. And this does a couple things. It stabilizes the roll line, but it also prevents the pickiness of the horsehair, which when you get it and you feel it, it can be really uncomfortable to feel it poking through. So this is going to cover that up. So here we've got my layers. I've got the wrapped hair against canvas, and then I've got a shoulder piece of the 721 hair cloth, then the bridle piece. Then I'm going to put some felt over it, that SFT 80 that's circulating. And that's just going to prevent more of the hair from poking through and making it really uncomfortable. So I'll trim it to shape, and then I'll pad stitch it. So I had a little demo of pad stitching too, but I was struggling with my lapels one day in 3D. And on her right, you're seeing it sticking away. And I couldn't get it to sit flat, And I thought, well, you know, in tailoring, I would pad stitch that lapel. I would roll the canvas over and run rows of stitches, and that would make it curve. And I said, well, I wonder if that would work in 3D. So I took the front, and I made a bunch of lines, and then I took some canvas, and I spaced the lines of canvas a tiny bit further so that I had to force it in, the same way I would do with pad stitching. And it actually made the lapel roll. So when we're working in 3D and things are not doing what we want to, sometimes it's good to think about what we do in the physical world and try to reproduce it. But sometimes that doesn't work either. And sometimes we've got to figure out something different. And maybe I would have had to have done the opposite to make it work. But really, the end result is what I'm concerned with, so who cares? But it's some of these things where you've got to know the software, because they don't all function the same. They don't all give you the effects you would expect. if you were curious and you want to play with it, here's some of the physical aspects for browseware. If you wanted to reproduce canvas, there's the thickness, the mass, and the bending width. Now, because there are no standards, this was actually tested for that other piece of software. And some of the physics I can convert quite easily, but some of them are not, because the testing, there's no standard testing parameters for these things. So it's a totally different, whereas one, they're testing the amount of pressure it takes to stretch it 50% of its length. Another one, they're just pulling it at 10 newtons of force and measuring the length, and then 40 newtons of force and measuring the length. So some I can convert, some I can't, but that's the important stuff. So if you wanted to play in VStitcher, there's the physics parameters for the canvas, and then there's for the haircloth. Because what you can do is you can actually make your pieces, and love the attach function. Because when you're getting multiple layers in it, if you try to sew it in like you would in real life, you're going to suffer. But you can use the attach function, and it's super easy, and it actually works. Quickly, we talked about shrinking and stretching. So I could use the edge properties and either define a certain percentage. In this case, I said, I want to shrink my armhole by 10%. So I went into shrinkage, and I changed that amount to 10%. But also, if there was a fixed amount, I could have put that. And then maybe I want to play with the styling tool, because I can do a certain amount of shrinking and stretching, and you can extend it. Well, you can extend the line. So I can shrink the line and extend it a few centimeters to bring it closer to the shoulder. In this case, I wanted to stretch it, so I'm actually going to set the shrink amount to a negative value, or go to the amount, and it started as 14.5 centimeters, and I'll turn it into 15.25, which will end up stretching. And it may cause some artifacts, and maybe I have to go in and do some fiddling with the styling. But you kind of get the idea of, and here I'm using the styling tool to stretch the blade, where you got to play with it a little bit. You got to get used to what it does, what it can't do. And if it gets to the point where you really can't do what you think you need to do, then you call up your customer service rep or your technical support and say, here, I'm stuck, fix it, please. Because I've run out of time, I'll circulate this. And I've also got some prefab. These are some canvas fronts that we would use in a factory. These are from MB Preform. So in this case, you see that the shoulder is quite extended. So I might use this if I didn't want a shoulder pad, but I still need some support in the back. And here's some canvas that doesn't have that extended, and I love the hand of this canvas. And this is the one from the picture that I made and pad stitched myself. So we'll pass these around. One from there. And because I think I'm out of time, I think Anna's up next. Ooh. So again, and if we have time over the next few days, and if you have more questions about physics and physical parameters and how to make it function in 3D, or about how I would do it in a bespoke tailor shop, we're here for a while. And so we can talk about it. In fact, one of the beauties of these events is that maybe we'll get a group of us that are interested, and we'll find a table somewhere and talk about what each of us do. And we may do them completely differently. We each have our own ways, and that's great. And we'll talk about them and share them. And I hope to come away from here having learned something from all of you. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Anna, who will talk about, because while I've been talking about physics, we haven't talked at all about how the fabric appears on the outside, and how do we achieve that in 3D. And that's Anna.